They laughed when she stood at the altar, a preacher's daughter marrying a quiet, dusty cowboy who owned nothing but his saddle and his word. In a town that measured worth by gold and land, love was their poorest currency. But beneath his silence lay a truth buried deeper than any mine, a secret inheritance written in the blood of the frontier, waiting to rise again. By the time they realized who he really was, laughter turned to silence, and silence to awe, because some fortunes aren't counted in dollars, but in destiny. Before we ride deeper into the story, if the spirit of the old frontier still stirs your heart, the campfire tales, the courage, the dust, and the honor, then saddle up with us. Hit subscribe and ring the bell so you'll never miss another ride through the legends of the Wild West. Now, let's get back to the trail. The sun rested on the ridge like a slow, honest hand letting go, and Clara Hayes stood under the church's warped beam as if she had always known this was where she would be. Steady, rooted, small and larger than the town's gossip could imagine. The congregation watched with the appetite of people who tally virtue and folly the same way they count coin. Quick, sharp, believing themselves wise. They had come to see what would become of the preacher's daughter, and what they saw was a plain man in a thread-worn coat, dust in the seams of his hat, a slow breath that matched the land's own. Eli Ward's face kept quiet, his eyes held back a landscape. Folks whispered that she could have married a man with ledgers and a polished boot. They chuckled into their sleeves when vows were spoken. Clara heard it all like wind from a closed window, present, distant, unable to pierce the thing forming between her and the man who placed his hand in hers as if touching a relic. In that touch was no pretense, only a vow without jewelry, a promise not wrapped in show but in the small, stubborn truth of a man who wakes before dawn because the world asks him to. The preacher cleared his throat. The words were thin with ritual and weight. They slid off the pews and gathered at the rafters where dust made patterns of old prayers. The town expected ceremony to mean acceptance. The ceremony did not alter their letter. She could have had better, someone muttered, as if fate were a currency they owned the right to spend. Laughter rose and fell like distant hoofbeats, brittle and easy. Clara did not see humiliation in Eli's face. She saw history and shadow in the shape of a boy who had lost more than anyone in that valley knew to count. She saw him listen to the way the sun set and the way the wind named the gullied hills. She heard in his silence an archive of wrongs and a map of what redemption might look like if two people decided to carry it together. There were those in the pews who had judged him on the dust of his boots and the quiet of his speech, who measured dignity by how loudly a man could claim it. And there were children on the back benches who watched with a larger hunger, eyes wide at the sight of simple faith. The organ wheezed an uncertain hymn. Outside, the wind moved like a thing remembering something it had been told long ago, a memory that smelled of horses, damp earth, and old promises. A hawk circled, patient and uninterested in the petty accounts of men. Clara's fingers tightened. She could feel Eli's pulse, slow and stubborn, as if someone had taught his heart the art of waiting. When the preacher asked if there were any objections, a silence fell so complete it felt like a third presence in the room. Even the gossips swallowed a retort. The question hung not because there were no objections, but because the town's objections had already been aired in private, in the leaning corners of stores and the back porches where morals are embroidered into resistance. Then the vows came, short, plain, without flourish. Eli's voice found a level that made it into more than a sound. It became a place to stand. Clara answered with a certainty that surprised some and unsettled others. In that small exchange, in the way two names were made a tether, the church felt the first stirrings of a thing larger than ridicule, an uncompromising allegiance that did not ask permission from those who kept score. The wind lifted the hem of Clara's dress and carried a stray whisper of prophecy, not a boast, not a thunderclap, but the slow, certain hint that when the town's laughter settled into the dirt, the quiet between them would grow into a force the valley could not simply dismiss. They left the church under a sky that had lost its last gold. The townspeople's smirks followed them like shadows, small, predictable. Clara walked beside Eli as the congregation shuffled back into their lives, and for the first time she felt her choice as a kind of moral defiance, not loud, not vindictive, but immovable like a stone in a river, altering the current with its mere presence. Days blurred into a ledger of small cruelties, each murmuring turned shoulder entering the account of their new life as if townsfolk were tallying sins rather than names, and the weight of that scorn settled like dust on every surface they touched. Shopkeepers double-checked scales when Eli set coins on counters, palms staying just out of reach as if his dust might stain their ledgers, and the saloon watched him like a wary animal, while ranchers who once tipped their hats now answered with clipped syllables and kept conversation to fence posts and the weather, as if a man's worth might be measured by how loudly he could claim it. Clara felt each slight as a pinprick under her skin, the hush of children at the livery when she passed, the quick gathering of gossip behind folded hands, the cautious way women in the dry goods store pretended not to notice the thinness of Eli's coat. Every glance was a small verdict handed down in a town that preferred easy judgments over hard truths. Yet Eli carried their disdain with a kind of quiet that was not defeat but a stubborn dignity, the kind of slow, faithful presence that refused to be baited. He did not pretense, did not shout, did not turn accusations into spectacle. His silence became a thing of weight, an iron balance that braced him against the petty scales of Red Mesa. At dawn he would slide from bed before the preacher's house had finished dreaming, saddle up and ride toward the gullied hills where the land split open and hid its secrets, and he would return long after the sun had folded itself away, knees and palms caked with red clay that whispered of gullies and ancient washes, as if he had spent his days tracing a map the town refused to read. Clara followed him once at a distance, heart a small animal in her ribs, not to spy but to learn what claim the earth had on him. She watched him move through the badlands with an easy, familiar rhythm, hands finding the seams of rock, his voice low as he spoke to shapes only he could name, directions, memories, a ledger of place. One night she could not sleep and slipped from their bed to find him on the ridge, a silhouette under a wide, starlit sky, and he did not notice her until he spoke aloud to the wind in a cadence that was part remembrance and part reckoning. Words that were not prayer and not the ramblings of a man undone, but the careful inventory of a grief made methodical. They took more inland, he said, voice thin and steady, as if reading from a list he had kept in his bones. They took names, graves, the right to speak of what was ours. He traced a scar on the dirt with a forefinger, as if feeling for an old pulse, and Clara heard in his murmuring a history of wrongs that had been folded into the earth like a secret will. Images aligned in her mind, of a younger Eli with soot on his knuckles, of men arriving in coats too fine for the valley, of doors that refused to open, of a father whose trust was repaid with a knife in the night, and she understood then that his quiet was not shame but remembrance, a force shaped by loss rather than the spectacle of vengeance. At home he spoke softly to her with a tenderness that belied the town's gossip. He told her of a Kenyan that held an old oak like a relic, of how rain wakes the clay and makes it sing, of the way the light fell on stubble in spring. Once he said, "Don't let their counting make you small," and she learned that he measured life differently, in names kept, promises kept, and wounds remembered until they might be used to heal. The scorn continued, a slow abrasion that either tears down or polishes into something older and truer. But Clara watched it and found their own resolve in the mirror it held. Every slight became a brick in the quiet foundation they were building together, a structure not of coin nor gossip but carved from the stubborn loyalty and low, unshowy love they kept like flint, ready to strike when the moment demanded a spark. The prospector's arrival split a slow afternoon like a cracked file in the margin of a ledger, an old man limping with a gait stitched from misadventures, skin leathered and eyes small and bright with the particular spark of someone who spends quiet years listening for echoes in rock. He paused at the boardwalk, the town's hum dipping a fraction as if to hear what the new sound might say, and when his gaze found Eli it did not slide away like the rest of the town's judgments but steadied and shivered with recognition. He reached up, fingers trembling with work and whiskey, and said, as if reading a name aloud from a pulp family Bible, "You've got your father's eyes," then melted into the saloon doorway like a man who had said what he'd come to say and could now leave the rest to fate. The words lodged in Clara's chest, a small stone under the sternum, and she found herself watching Eli the way someone studies a map after hearing there might be treasure. He met her look with a softness that did not invite questions, and when she pressed, once, twice, in the privacy of their kitchen where the lamp made soft moons of the cups, he deflected with a story about ridges and a childhood that belonged to bad weather and long trails. "No use stirring old dirt," he murmured, but the way he set his hands on the table showed that some kinds of dirt were already stirred. That night, while the town slept and the preacher's house held its breath, Claire turned the saddlebag out like a slow ritual, searching for the shape of the man she had married in the same way a river might search for its own source. Beneath the oilcloth in a folded rag, her fingers found metal, cold and familiar, and when she lifted it, the moonlight pinned a silver crest into relief, a worn insignia, curved smooth by decades of handling, the letters almost rubbed away but still saying Ward in a hand that remembered itself. Beneath the crest lay a sealed letter, wax brown like old coin, stamped in a script that named one thing plainly: Ward Estate, Red Mesa, and the sight of that address made the room tilt as if a long-held horizon had been nudged. Clara did not sleep. She sat with the envelope in her lap until the stars left the sky and the first pale hoarse sigh of dawn touched the eaves, and every little sound the house made became the footfall of an earlier life walking up the stairs. The next morning she watched Helas from the doorway as he strapped his saddlebag on, his silhouette a slow question against the light, and she understood that the town's easy mockery had been a blind they had both accepted because the truth beneath their feet was too dangerous, too heavy to dread with words. News in a valley travels quicker than a fever. By noon the prospectors' mutterings were a kind of rumor that folded itself into the bakery's talk, then the barrooms, then the bank's polished stare, and the ledger men who had once counted themselves safe began to glance at Eli with a new kind of interest, caution wrapped in hunger. Because once a name is noticed by a man who measures the land with his memory, proprietors and pretenders alike began to worry about what debts might be called due. Clara kept the crest in the letter like a relic against doubt. She traced the chip in the silver with her thumb and felt at once the weight of inheritance and the sharper weight of history. Names crossed out, fences moved, graves rendered anonymous by convenience, and in that private inventory she saw how her husband's quiet was not empty but crowded with the lives of those who had come before him and who had been cheated of their resting places. She began to notice how Eli listened to the wind differently now, how his silence housed plans rather than surrender, how his gaze reached for the hills with a precision that made her think of maps and wills, and while the town continued to laugh and fit him into its old boxes, Clara kept the corner of that letter folded beneath her pillow as if she were tucking a promise into the bed itself, waiting for the day the whisper in the saloon would become a drumbeat that woke the whole valley. Night came on Eli like a hand remembering how to hold, practical, weathered, not gentle. Sleep for him was never a blank but a ledger where the past and present traded in the same ink, and the entries came in dreams of fire and betrayal that tasted of iron and old promises. In those dreams the Ward homestead burned slow, not with sudden lightning but with a patient, smoldering hunger, the kind of firemen start when they mean to erase more than wood. Eli watched the porch give way and felt the silhouettes of men in fine coats arguing over deeds and cattle, voices he could almost name, and in the hiss of that flame his father's face was a map, lines of care, a jowl folded by decisions that had shaped a valley. Silas Ward had once held the land like a creed. Neighbors leaned on his fences as if seeking steadiness. Hands were hired and paid because his word was a kind of coin, and loyalty grew around his name like shelter. He built not merely ranches but an expectation: do right by a man and his children will remember you. But greed came like rust on iron, quiet at first, then it eats. Men arrived with smooth promises and pockets of law, and they smoothed the edges of contracts until the heart of covenant slipped from the town's grasp. Deeds were rewritten, fences moved, graves left anonymous by convenience, and the force that had kept the valley honest was undermined by suits and saloons that measured worth by balance sheets rather than by the reliability of a man's handshake. Eli had been a boy in that world, wild-haired, stubborn, learning the language of weather and fence posts at his father's knee. Then the night the county learned how dirty its hands could be unrolled like a map of ruin, silence was killed in a way the town later softened into rumor, labeled an accident or a robbery gone wrong. While the ledger that held names was hidden beneath floorboards and in private pockets, the truth was a list of signatures bowed with grain and lies, and the boy who watched his father fall ran into the wilderness with nothing but memory and the smoke of a life burning in his mouth. Years folded him into a man whose hands read like rings on a tree, calloused and honest, and when he returned the town saw a dust-creased coat and called him simple because simplicity is a shape people mark to avoid asking uncomfortable questions. But inside Eli, the boy who had learned from Silas kept a slow, unblinking watch. He remembered names the way a ledger remembers debts. He kept hours like maps keep routes, and he carried his father's lessons folded close. Often, in the dry hush between midnight and the first rooster, his father's voice threatened the dreamscape. when they laugh at you, son. Remember, gold don't shine without darkness. It was not a curse but a compass, a reminder that fortune carries shadow, and those who take light without knowing the dark will always be found wanting. The line became Eli's quiet doctrine. He learned that silence could be a tool and a shield, not surrender but strategy. Answer only when it changes the world. Preserve strength for the moment it's needed, and keep grief as fuel for justice rather than spectacle. Clara saw the fragments of this inheritance of the edges of him, the way a name made his jaw tighten, the way the hills tugged at his sleeves, the way a certain slope of light would pull him to his feet at dawn. When the prospectors remarked about having his father's eyes drifted into their kitchen, he only said, "Some things are best dug up when you've got a spade," but his hands betrayed a man cataloging grievance and geometry alike. In daylight he bore the town's mockery like a slow abrasion, but at night he tended the true inheritance of the Ward line, memory, accounts of wrongs kept safe until the day justice could be made more than rumor. The man he never spoke of lived in the spaces between breaths, a presence shaped by loss and tempered by survival, and the valley itself held its history like a wound that might, when cut clean and true, finally be sutured back into the land. Because for Eli the question was never how much was left in the bank but who had the moral audacity to return what was stolen, and how love, Clara's steady, defiant love, might be the small and stubborn light to lead him through the dark. The stranger arrived like a bad rumor, stepping off the stagecoach with a coat as black as a dead and face cut into stories, scar tissue like a map of nights that remembered knives and hard living, breath smelling of whiskey and old roads, and he carried himself with a stillness that made the boardwalk seem suddenly too loud. Men at the post and boys sweeping the walk straightened as if the town's bones had shifted. He moved with the economy of someone who'd learned violence doesn't need flourish, and when his eyes found Eli Ward they did not slide away like most. They stopped and sharpened and gathered recognition like a hand that weighs coin. Clara saw him first from the general store, a rag folded in her hands as if to hide that she had been listening for the valley's small catastrophes, and the way the prospector had named Eli's eyes earlier answered itself in the stranger's look. He stood in the saloon doorway and said a name that had been kept to whispers, Colt Marin, and the sound of it struck the air like a thrown stone. Old men who remembered the Ward ranch stiffened, and the preacher's brother pretended to tie his boot but watched with the strained interest of those who count the steps before a fight. Colt's gait was the kind that argued he had once been of loyalty and had learned how to take payment in other currencies. He had been a hand at Silas Ward's place, the kind who knows fences by their splinters and men by how their debts are kept, and rumor had always put him at the crossroads of betrayal. He moved through the room with a smile that did not reach his eyes and stopped where Eli stood by the livery, and the town's breath creased into a rumor of its own. Heads turned, the piano keys hesitated, and a dog stopped mid-bark. Ward blood don't hide forever. Colt hissed under his breath like a promise that had been kept too long, and the phrase rode the dust like an omen. Eli's jaw tightened the way a man's jaw does when a ledger is opened and the totals are not what one expected. He did not answer with a curse or a slap, but his posture folded into a readiness that made the hair along Clara's forearm rise. She felt the old land press against her ribs, an animal alert to scent, because the past that lived in the hills had found its way to their street. Clara reached for Eli's hand and found it steady, not rough with the need to strike but steady in a way that felt like preparation. This man's trades were not performed with shouting but with a measured economy. Colt moved among the crowd, scanning faces, dropping names like small stones to see which ones rippled. He paused by the bank's polished window and spat a thin line of tobacco juice at the reflection of the man who had profited from the Ward fall. His glance grazed them like a judge reading a ledger that names those who owe. "You were small then," he said to Eli so that only the two of them heard, the words low and carrying the weight of accusation, the kind of memory that never forgives. The saloon's light tilted, and Clara saw a sudden change in the look of men who had once smiled over ledger books, a hesitation, a calculation. Greed and guilt are cousins, and seeing a potential claim acknowledged them both. Colt's presence was a vector. It pointed toward a history the town preferred to keep folded into neat receipts and polite explanations. He drank slowly, eyes never leaving Eli, and when he left he did so like a man who had thrown the first match into a dry field, his departure a smaller motion with catastrophic intent. Clara could feel the valley rearrange itself in small ways. The butcher's jokes thickened, The bank clerk's ledger grew guarded, and boys who had laughed when she married a man with dust on his shoes found themselves watching for signs they could not yet name. That night the wind carried a harsher rage, and Clara heard Eli on the porch, speaking not to her but aloud as if the dark needed the record. "He remembers what was taken," Eli murmured, voice low enough to be private and loud enough to land, and Claire understood then that Colt's arrival had turned rumor into threat and secret into the first audible step toward reckoning. The past had never been a quiet thing, only patient, and now it had marched back into town with a scarred face and a whiskey-stiff arm, ready to call up old ghosts and force accounts that men had hoped would rot away beneath polite soil. While we catch our breath by this dusty road, go on and tip your hat to the last rodeo. Give this story a like and subscribe so you can ride with us again soon. All right then, let's get back on the trail. They rode out before dawn, the world a great promise, and the canyon beyond Red Mesa opened before them like a mouth that had been waiting to be spoken into. Eli guided the horse with a quiet certainty, as if the route were a line in his palm, and Clara kept close, breath held against the cold and the weight of what might be found. The land there held old bones, fossil ridges and the soft graves of washed-out fences, and the air smelled of crushed sage and the slow rot of seasons. Eli dismounted and walked to an oak stump that rose from the soil like a weathered sentinel, its roots braided through dead summer and winter alike. He placed his palm on the stump as if touching the spine of a book, and for a moment the canyon seemed to hold its breath with them. He took a shovel from the saddlebag, its metal edge bright with the memory of previous digs, and began to work in a rhythm that mirrored things Clara had only seen in him when he tended a mirror mend the fence. Careful, patient, the kind of work that spoke of a man who would learn how to coax truth from the earth rather than demand it. Hours passed with the sun climbing slow and merciless. Her hands were numb by the time Adolphe had answered the shovel's cut and she saw Eli's face change like the weather, that half recognition that goes under skin when something impossible has proven true. He cleared away clay and roots until the shovel struck wood. Beneath the stump a tin box surfaced, its lid mottled with rust but still stubbornly closed. Eli's fingers fumbled with the latch like a man opening a relic. When the lid peeled back, the smell of old paper and coin breathed out, and for a moment they both inhaled the past. Inside lay faded deeds with handwriting that looped like old vines, gold coins that had lost their bright at the edges but still clinked like small accusations when tipped, and a map folded into quarters with routes and names inked in a hand that was Silas Ward's or a man who knew him intimately. Clara's fingers trembled as she lifted a deed. The paper was thin as skin, the ink a brown where a signature declared property that read like a promise once made and then broken. Ward Estate, Red Mesa. One document whispered in the way she now read letters, not as flat law but as testament. Eli's face did not shift into celebration. It locked into a grave geometry that set her chest cold. He closed the box gently and ran a thumb along a coin as if feeling for its edges, then met her eyes with a clarity that was almost cruel in its precision. "This ain't about gold," he said, voice the kind of plain that carried everything it needed. "It's about what was taken, and who I've got to face to set it right." The words landed like stones dropped into still water. The ripple traveled faster than either of them expected. Clara thought at once of the men at the bank, of the hands that had smoothed deeds and refiled names like tailoring garments to fit new bodies. She thought of fences moved at night, of graves that had been given new markers with other men's names, and the photograph of Silas that had once hung in the mercantile, all stern shoulders and the look of a man who meant to be remembered honestly. To Eli, the tin box was not merely the recovery of currency. It was an inventory of theft, an index of wrongs that had been papered over. He unfolded the map with a surgeon's care and pointed out names, landmarks erased from modern surveys, a creek that had been rerouted in the notation of some county clerk, the coordinates to a foundation where ledger pages might still be sewn into timbers. As Clara read, indignation and an ache like grief braided inside her. The town's mockery slotted into a new narrative, not a simple man mocked for his dust, but the son of a wronged family who had returned to measure the debt properly. Eli spoke less and planned more, and Clara watched the man she had married shift from patient to strategist with a calm that frightened and steadied her at once. He spoke of confronting names, of bringing the ledger to light, of the violence that might be required to force memory into law. He did not say revenge, only rectification, the distinction cutting a clean line through his intent. The canyon seemed to listen, Wind threaded the sage and carried their small oath outward, and as they packed the tin box and the map back into the saddlebag, Clara felt the weight of destiny settle between them, not gaudy like the gold, but heavier and truer, a burden that would demand courage and patience and the kind of love that refuses to blink when the town counts wounds as ledger entries. They rode at first light, the horizon burning pale and merciless as if the sky itself remembered what had happened there, and the closer they drew to Red Mason the quieter Eli became, his silence a living thing between them, heavy with ghosts that had waited years for breath. Clara could feel the tension running through him like a tightened wire, and though she had seen him steady before, this was something else, his posture straighter, his hands purposeful, his eyes narrowing into that focused distance of a man measuring not miles but reckonings. The land unfolded in slow ruin, fences half buried under years of dust, barns reduced to ribs, the house little more than bones of timber blackened by the fire that had taken his father. Even the wind there carried a bitterness, the scent of scorched oak and sun-baked metal still lingering after decades. Eli dismounted without a word, boots sinking into the soft ash where the Ward ranch once held court over the valley, and Clara watched him stand there as if the earth beneath him was both inheritance and accusation. He knelt, running his hand through the blackened dirt, and for a long time he didn't move, just breathing, eyes closed, as though listening for the hum of something still buried. "This is where he died," he said finally, voice low but hard-edged, and Clara understood he wasn't speaking to her. He was speaking to the land, to the air, to the ghost of a man who had built this world with his hands only to be consumed by its betrayal. She stepped forward, resting her hand on his shoulder, feeling the muscle tight as stone beneath her palm. "We can start again," she whispered, but Eli shook his head slowly. "No," he said. "We finish first." The words were plain, unadorned, and final. In that instant, the simple cowboy, the quiet, dust-covered man she had married, was gone. What stood in his place was Silas Ward's son, a man tempered by loss and bent toward justice like an iron drawn to fire. They spent hours walking the ruins, tracing the outlines of a life stolen, the corral where horses once pawed the earth, the well long choked with debris, the remnants of his father's office, charred beams still holding nails that once framed maps and contracts now gone to ash. Clara saw in Eli's eyes a glimmer of something she feared and admired all at once, resolve so deep it bordered on possession. He spoke names she did not know, men who had signed away land that wasn't theirs, men whose families still profited off stolen soil. Each name fell like a stone into the canyon of his silence. As they worked, clouds rolled in thick from the west, dragging shadows across the land like dark memories, and the air grew restless. Clara felt eyes on them, though no one was near. It was only later, when they stopped to rest, that she saw them, three silhouettes far off against the ridge, unmoving, watching. Colt Merrill and his men. The distance did not dull the recognition, even from afar. That scarred face was a brand on memory. "They've been trailing us since town," Eli murmured, pulling his hat low, eyes cold. "They'll come when the light breaks again." Clara's stomach tightened. "For the gold?" she asked. Eli shook his head. "For what's left of it, and for me." There was no fear in his voice, only the calm of inevitability. They built a small camp by what remained of the house, and as night settled in, Eli sat staring into the fire, the flicker carving shadows across his face that made him look both older and truer than she had ever seen. "This land ain't just dirt," he said softly. "It's proof. It's all the lies buried under law and greed. My father tried to build something honest here. They burned it down to make their own kind of truth." The wind rose, whistling through the empty corral, and somewhere far off a coyote cried like a warning. Clara reached for his hand. It was cold, but steady, the hand of a man who had chosen the harder road and would not turn back. Above them, the stars stretched endless and uncaring, bearing silent witness as the past began its march toward reckoning, and in the shifting firelight, Eli's shadow stretched long over the ruins, part man, part memory, and entirely a Ward come home to claim what had been stolen, even as vengeance rode close enough behind to taste the dust he left in his wake. The storm came first, dragging a great curtain over the sky as if to mark their crossing from memory into reckoning, and by dusk the world had turned to mud and ghosts. They rode through it until the faint outline of a homestead appeared against the dying light, half-collapsed roof, porch leaning like an old drunk, a single lantern burning weakly in the window. Mara Fitch lived there still, though most believed her long gone or buried under the land she refused to sell. She had been Silas Ward's most loyal hand, sharp-eyed, a woman who'd traded laughter for endurance long before the rest of the valley learned how fragile goodness could be. When she opened the door, the lamplight carved deep lines in her face, her gaze moving from Eli to Clara and back again, recognition dawning like something painful. "Silas's boy," she murmured, voice half disbelief, half sorrow. "You came back after all." Eli nodded, rain dripping from his hat brim, words slow and weighted. Didn't have much choice left. She let them in without ceremony, without questions, the door creaking shut behind them like an old oath sealing itself once more. The air inside smelled of cedar smoke and iron, the room crowded with relics from another life, horse tack, old ledgers, a faded photograph of men standing proud in front of the Ward brand before greed and blood had turned it into ruin. Mara moved with the deliberate care of someone who knows every step is a decision. She poured coffee into tin cups and steadied him over the steam. "Red Mesa don't forget," she said. "And it don't forgive. Your father thought he could tame it. The land took him for the trouble." Eli's eyes flickered to the window where the storm pressed its fingers against the glass. "It wasn't the lion that killed him," he said. "It was men hiding behind it." Mara gave a bitter chuckle, the kind that came from surviving truth too long. "Men, lion, all one and the same out here. Both take more than they give." Her gaze softened as she turned to Clara. "And you, preacher's girl, you got no place in this fight." But Clara met her stare, unblinking. "My place is where he stands," she said simply, and something in Mara's expression broke, just slightly, like thawing ice. She went to a wooden chest in the corner and lifted its lid with the reverence of a prayer. Inside lay tools of a vanished life, ledgers tied with twine, a revolver that hadn't been fired in years, and a small iron key strung on a strip of faded blue cloth. She held it out to Eli with hands that trembled not from weakness but from the gravity of what she was giving away. "Your father gave me this the night before they came for him," she said, voice dropping low. "Told me it opened something he'd built, or buried. Said if the boy ever found his way home, I'd know when to pass it on." Eli took it in silence, the metal cold against his skin, heavy with the weight of inheritance and unfinished things. "What's it open?" he asked, but Mara only shook her head. "Something you've been running from, whether you know it or not. Maybe truth, maybe damnation. The Ward name's tied to both." Outside, thunder rolled like a distant drum, and Clara shivered despite the fire. Mara leaned closer, her eyes fierce and sorrowful all at once. "Men killed for that land, Eli Ward. Don't think they won't again. You dig deep enough, you'll find bones mixed with every handful of soil." He nodded, slipping the key into his pocket, and for a moment the room seemed to still, the wind pausing as if listening. "Then I reckon it's time I stopped running," he said quietly. Mara watched him, seeing it in both the man and the boy she'd once known, and she whispered, almost to herself, "You're your father's son after all." When they left, the storm had gentled, but the land around Red Mesa looked changed, like it was holding its breath. Clara glanced back at the homestead, one small light flickering against the dark horizon, and she realized that some warnings aren't meant to stop a soul. They're meant to prepare it. Dawn came quietly, the kind of fragile light that carries more promise than warmth, and the valley held its breath beneath the pale sky. Eli and Clara rode the ridge above Red Mesa with the world still asleep beneath them, unaware that death had already found its place in the day's script. The horses moved slow through the shale, their breath misting in the chill air, when the first shot cracked like the earth itself had split. It missed Eli's head by inches, sparking against stone, and the silence that followed lasted no longer than a heartbeat before the world erupted. Gunfire from every side, the thunder of hooves, the scream of bullets tearing through dust and dawn. Clara hit the ground as Eli swung from his saddle, his revolver already drawn, movements clean, economical, like a man who learned to fight not from courage but necessity. Colt Marin's men came hard and loud, 6 of them, faces wrapped in scarves, eyes burning with the greed that had kept the Ward name buried all these years. Eli moved with a precision that didn't belong to a simple ranch hand. Every emotion was instinct toned by long quiet years of waiting, the stillness before each shot more dangerous than the shot itself. He ducked behind a boulder, firing once, twice, each bullet finding its mark with unerring certainty. The ridge filled with smoke and echoes. Men fell into the dust they'd sworn to own, and the air grew thick with the iron scent of gunpowder and regret. Claire pressed herself against the rocks, trembling, breath ragged, watching the man she thought she knew unfold into someone both foreign and inevitable. He wasn't reckless. He was controlled fury, a silent reckoning carved into flesh and grit. She saw the boy his father must have taught, the weight of a gun balanced not in anger but justice, and she understood in that moment that Eli's silence had never been weakness. It was the slow gathering of a storm. One of Colt's men flanked him from the west, the sun flashing off his rifle. Eli saw the reflection before the man moved, spun, and fired through the rising light. The shot echoed like a curse, the bandit collapsing into his own dust. Another came crawling from the slope, close enough that Clara could see the whites of his eyes before Eli's bullet found him too. When the gunfire faded, it left behind only wind, the kind that comes after ruin, whispering over bodies, carrying the last rattled breaths away. Clara rose slowly, her hands still shaking, the acrid smoke curling around her like the ghost of something ancient. 5 men lay still. Only 2 figures moved, Eli, crouched in the dirt, bleeding from a shallow gash along his arm, and Colt Marion, standing at the edge of the ridge, a pistol in his hand and a grin carved across his scarred face. The 2 men faced each other through the haze, the years between them folding like pages turning to the same unfinished chapter. "Didn't think the boy had it in him," Colt rasped, his voice half admiration, half venom. Eli didn't answer. He holstered his revolver, eyes never leaving the man who'd betrayed his father. "You took everything," he said finally, voice low and certain. "Land, lives. But you couldn't take what was left in the blood." Colt spat into the dust, a dark stain at his boots. "Blood's cheap out here," he growled, raising his pistol. The sun climbed higher, spilling gold over the ridge, turning the smoke into ghostlight. Clara wanted to scream, to run, but the weight of what hung between the 2 men held her still. Time itself seemed to hesitate. 2 guns, 2 lives, the dead of decades balanced on the width of a trigger. And then, a pause, a breath, the sound of wind through the canyons, and the ridge went quiet again, as if the world itself was listening. When the smoke cleared, only 2 men remained breathing, their shadows long and jagged against the scarred earth: Eli Ward, son of the man betrayed, and Colt Marion, the betrayer himself. Between them lay the fallen, the dust, and one truth still buried beneath the red soil, something darker than greed, older than vengeance, and waiting, patient, for the moment it would finally be unearthed. The path to the truth wound through the belly of Red Mesa like a buried vein, and by the time Eli and Clara reached the half-collapsed barn drawn on Silas Ward's map, the light had begun to fade into that uneasy amber between day and dusk, the kind that makes the world seem older, as if the land itself remembers what men try to forget. The barn stood at the edge of a dry creek bed, its roof slumped in ribs of timber jutting upward like broken fingers clawing toward heaven. Clara could smell the dust before they entered, the kind of dry, settled air that had not been disturbed in years. They moved quietly, boots creaking against warm boards, and as Eli pulled back the matted hay in the corner, the dull clink of metal echoed faintly, a sound too deliberate to belong to chance. Beneath a layer of straw, half buried in the earth, lay an iron trapdoor, edges eaten by rust but still sturdy, a relic sealed by purpose. Eli brushed away the debris, revealing a small keyhole worn smooth by time. From his pocket he drew the key Mara Finch had given him, the one his father had pressed into her hand before the fire. For a long moment, he only held it there, thumb tracing the groove as if to measure the weight of destiny in something so small. Then, without ceremony, he slid it into the lock. The sound it made when it turned was not mechanical. It was alive, like the deep breath of something waking after a long sleep. The door opened with a groan that stirred the dust of decades, and a cold, dry wind rose from below, carrying the scent of paper, wax, and secrets. Eli took the lantern from Clara's hand and descended first, the wooden ladder creaking under his weight. She followed, heart hammering, until her boots met stone. The chamber below was larger than she'd expected, carved from rock, lined with shelves and crates, each one labeled in Silas Ward's hand. The lantern light danced across the room, illuminating not gold or jewels, but rows upon rows of ledgers, journals bound in cracked leather, and boxes filled with documents sealed in wax. The air felt sacred, heavy with preservation and intent. Clara ran her fingers across a ledger, the ink faded but legible, the name at the top reading Ward Holdings, Trust and Transfer. Inside were entries that twisted her stomach, records of land transactions, forged signatures, falsified claims. He kept it all, she whispered, all mixing with sorrow. Eli knelt beside a crate, opening it with careful hands. Inside lay a bundle of letters, their seals broken, each bearing names that carried weight in town: the banker, the sheriff, the mayor, the men who had carved up Silas Ward's empire after his death. This was his fortune, Eli said quietly, eyes scanning the pages. Not gold. Truth. He opened a second ledger and read aloud in a voice that trembled not from fear but from recognition. Silas Ward, dispossessed by the signatures of men he once called kin. His father's words spilled across the years like blood reawakened. Clara felt her throat tighten. He built this to be found, she said softly. Eli nodded. So his son could finish what he couldn't. They worked in silence for hours, uncovering proof of betrayal layered with precision, deeds rewritten, property transferred under false pretenses, even records of payments to the very hands that had struck the match that ended the Ward legacy. Every page was a confession signed in ink and deceit. When they had gathered the most damning pieces, Eli placed them carefully in a satchel, his movements reverent, deliberate. He looked around one last time, his gaze sweeping across his father's hidden vault. He didn't hide treasure, Eli murmured, his voice low, reverent. He buried evidence. The lantern flickered, casting long shadows across the stone walls, and Clara felt the enormity of it settle into her bones. Above them, the world remained blind and proud, but beneath the earth the truth had been waiting, patient, certain, preserved in silence. Eli closed the trapdoor as they climbed back into the night, sealing it once more, not out of fear, but out of respect. Now we've got what they buried him for, he said, slipping the key back into his pocket. And as they mounted their horses, the first stars blinked awake over Red Mesa, their faint light trembling like the conscience of a town about to be judged by its own forgotten sins. While we catch our breath by this dusty road, go on and tip your hat to the last rodeo. Give this story a like, and subscribe so you can ride with us again soon. All right then. Let's get back on the trail. The truth came to Eli like thunder rolling from far off, slow at first, then deafening. And by the time he and Claire reached the ridge overlooking the town, the realization had taken shape so sharp it felt carved into his chest. Every familiar building below, the church, the bank, the sheriff's office, even the saloon where men laughed too easily, was built not on faith or labor, but on the bones of his father's ruin. The ledgers in his saddlebag were no longer just paper. They were proof that the town's prosperity was an inheritance stolen in daylight, forged by hands that had smiled while shaking Silas Ward's. Clara watched him as the light bled out of the sky, her husband's face drawn tight with something between sorrow and rage, and when he finally spoke, his voice sounded like gravel dragged across steel. The banker, the sheriff, called. Every last one of them signed their name on what they took, he said. They made their fortunes on my father's blood. He dismounted, the movement deliberate, as if standing on this hill gave him the right to reclaim the air itself. For a moment he looked like a man deciding whether to forgive or destroy, and Clara saw the struggle in him, that endless push between the mercy his father had taught him and the vengeance the land demanded. Eli, she whispered, what will you do? He turned to her, eyes dark but steady. I never wanted vengeance, he said, voice trembling but sure. I wanted them to remember who they buried. The words hung in the fading light like a vial written in flame. He crouched beside the fire they'd built, pulling the ledgers and letters from the satchel, laying them out in neat rows, each document a sin resurrected. As the wind flicked at the edges of the pages, Clara read the names: Sheriff Amos Kerr, who'd signed the deed that stripped Silas of his water rights; Banker Harlan Pike, who'd loaned Silas money against property he'd already owned; and finally, Colt Marin, listed as an executor in a forged transfer of assets the week before Silas's death. They buried him in shame, Eli said, then built their pride on his grave. He took a slow breath, as if testing the weight of the decision forming behind his ribs. Tomorrow, I ride into town. I show them this. Every last page. I make them speak his name again. Clara felt the chill that came with understanding, the kind that whispers how courage and sacrifice are sometimes the same thing. "They'll kill you for it," she said. Eli looked up at her, a faint smile ghosting across his face. "Then they'll prove my point." For the first time since she'd known him, his calm frightened her more than his anger. It wasn't the heat of rage but the cold of conviction. He reached for her hand, fingers rough and warm, and placed a folded page into her palm. His father's handwriting, one line underlined twice, "Honor outlives those who bury it." "If something happens to me," he said, "you keep this, you tell them. You finish it." She shook her head, eyes stinging. "No," she said, voice cracking. "We finish it." The fire snapped between them, throwing shadows that looked like ghosts across the ground. In the distance, lightning flashed over the mesa, silent but threatening, and Eli stood, watching it as if waiting for judgment. "They think they took everything," he said quietly. "But the land remembers. The truth remembers. And now, so will they." He gathered the documents, tying them together with a strip of leather, his movements steady, deliberate, the final ritual of a man preparing for both justice and sacrifice. When he looked back toward the sleeping town, his eyes carried that same firelight, a mixture of sorrow, duty, and something larger than either. And Clara knew that when he rode down into that valley come morning, he would not be carrying gold, or anger, or even his father's name. He would be carrying the truth itself, heavy as redemption, unstoppable as dawn. The sky burned red that evening, a deep and bleeding hue that painted the town of Red Mesa like an omen, and the wind carried the taste of dust and judgment as Eli rode in alone, the sound of his horse's hoofs echoing through streets that had once mocked his name. Now, every creak of the saddle, every jingle of the reins, sounded like a verdict being read. Men paused mid-conversation outside the saloon, their laughter caught in their throats, and women watching from porches felt something shift in the air. Not fear, not yet, but the uneasy recognition that truth was riding toward them with the calm inevitability of dawn. Clara walked beside him, her face pale beneath her bonnet but her chin high, the preacher's daughter who had once been whispered about for choosing the simple cowboy. Now, the whispers had turned to silence. The church loomed ahead, its steeple jagged against the crimson sky, and inside waited the men who had buried his father with ink instead of shovels: Sheriff Amos Kerr, Banker Harlan Pike, Judge Orrin Bell, and Colt Marin, the scarred shadow now seated among the righteous, his hand never straying far from the pistol at his hip. The congregation had gathered for evening prayer, unaware or unwilling to believe that prayer could summon anything other than forgiveness. But when Eli Ward pushed open the door, the sound of it hitting the wall cut through the hymn like a blade. Every head turned. For a long, breathless moment, the only sound was the wind moaning through the cracks of the old church. Eli's boots struck the wooden floor in steady rhythm, each step an accusation. He carried no weapon in his hands, only a worn leather satchel that hung heavy at his side. Clara followed him down the aisle, her dress brushing the pews like a whisper of conscience. At the front, the men shifted uneasily. The sheriff's fingers twitched near his belt. The banker's throat bobbed as he swallowed guilt and pride in equal measure. Eli reached the altar, unbuckled the satchel, and set it down with a weight that made the boards groan. He opened it slowly, reverently, as though unveiling a relic of the old world, and one by one, he laid the ledgers across the altar, the firelight from the candles catching the edges of the pages like a slow, deliberate dawn. "Your prayers won't wash this away," he said, voice low but clear, and in that single sentence there was no anger, only truth, cold, undeniable, and final. The words rippled through the church, scattering the fragile illusions the town had built on silence. He turned the pages for all to see, deeds signed by hands that had sworn loyalty to Silas Ward, contracts rewritten to steal land that had fed the valley, letters exchanged in secret detailing the bribes and blood that had paved their fortune. "This is what you built your homes on," Eli continued, his voice steady. "You prayed over stolen land. You asked forgiveness from the same God whose law you broke with your own." The sheriff stood, face flushed, but the preacher himself, Clara's father, raised a hand for silence, his voice trembling as he said, "Let him speak." Eli looked out at the faces that had once sneered at him, the ones who'd called him worthless, and for a long moment, he said nothing. He simply looked, and the weight of his gaze was heavier than any bullet. Clara moved beside him then, placing her hand on his arm, not to hold him back, but to hold him steady. Together they stood before the altar, husband and wife, truth and faith side by side. "My father didn't die poor," Eli said quietly. "He died betrayed, and every man who profited from it knows it." No one dared move. The banker dropped his hat, the sheriff's eyes flicked to the floor. Even Cole, who had once spat on the Ward name, sat motionless, jaw clenched tight. The hymn book slipped from a trembling hand in the back pew, the sound echoing like a gunshot. Eli gathered the papers, set them atop the open Bible, and stepped back. "You've all prayed for peace," he said. "But peace can't live where truth's been buried." Outside, thunder cracked, sharp, sudden, close, and the candles wavered. In that moment, the entire town seemed to bow, not out of faith, but out of the dawning weight of their own sin. The laughter that had once followed Eli Ward through the streets of Red Mesa was gone. In its place lingered only silence, the kind that precedes confession, the kind that marks the hour when a town, for the first time in years, begins to reckon with its soul. The church doors exploded open with a violence that seemed to tear the night in half, the crash of wood against the walls echoing like a judgment long overdue, and in the shattered frame stood Colt Marin, the scarred ghost of every sin Red Mesa had buried, his pistol drawn, eyes lit with the kind of madness that comes when a man knows his lies are cornered. The congregation gasped, instinctively shrinking away, leaving the aisle open between him and Eli like a corridor built for fate. The lantern light trembled, shadows flickering across Colt's face, the old wound twisting when he spoke, voice rough and sharp as gravel. "So this is how it ends, huh, Ward boy? You stand in your daddy's church with your head high, thinking truth's worth dying for?" He stepped forward, boots pounding against the floorboards, each footfall ringing through the silence like a hammer driving a nail into memory. Eli turned to face him fully, his coat brushing against the edge of the altar, his hand resting near his holster but not yet drawing. The papers lay spread behind him, the letters, the proof, the ghosts of stolen lives, and Clara stood at his shoulder, unmoving, her eyes burning not with fear but defiance. "It ended the day you signed your name on a lie," Eli said quietly. "This is just the echo of it." Colt laughed, a broken, joyless sound that bounced off the church walls, and for a heartbeat the air between them held every wrong that had brought them here. Greed, betrayal, grief, and the blood debt of a father taken too soon. "Your old man thought he could buy justice with kindness," Colt snarled. "Turns out kindness don't buy much out here." His hand twitched, and the barrel of his pistol rose a fraction. Eli's eyes narrowed, his voice dropping to a whisper that carried more weight than any shout. "And cruelty don't buy a peace." Time folded in on itself then. No sound, no breath, only the pulse of inevitability pounding between two men who'd both lost too much. Clara could feel the moment hanging like a held breath, the congregation frozen behind her, the preacher's trembling hands still resting on his Bible as though prayer might hold back the bullet waiting in the air. Then it came, one heartbeat, one breath, one pull of the trigger. The gunfire shattered the silence, flame flaring like lightning in the gloom. Colt staggered, the force of the shot twisting him backward, the pistol slipping from his grasp and clattering uselessly to the floor. For a second, he remained standing, staring at Eli with something like recognition softening the fury in his eyes. Blood spread across his shirt, dark and slow, and his mouth moved around words that came out like a sigh. "You're your father's son," he whispered, the last syllable barely catching the air before he fell, the echo of his voice dying into the same dusty one stained with betrayal. The church remained still, the only sound the distant creak of the door swaying in the wind. Eli stood motionless, smoke curling from the barrel of his gun, his breath shaking, not from fear, but from the unbearable weight of release. The fight that had lived in him since boyhood, the grief, the silence, the shame, drained from his body like a fever breaking. His knees wavered, and Clara was there before he fell, her arms wrapping around him, grounding him back into a world where vengeance no longer had a place. The preacher's voice trembled a prayer into the air, but no one answered. Instead, The church bells began to toll, deep and slow, their sound rolling through the valley. And though they rang for death, every soul inside knew they were tolling for something else, for truth, for reckoning, for a name that had finally been cleared of its ghosts. Eli's hand closed around Clara's as they knelt together amid the smoke and silence, and when he finally looked up, his eyes were no longer the eyes of the boy who'd run from fire. They were his father's eyes, steady, unyielding, and filled with the quiet, enduring peace of a man who had at last laid the past to rest. Weeks softened into work and the valley began to breathe again as if exhaling a long, held grief. Where ash had lain and fences sagged, new posts rose square and true, and men who once tiptoed past the Ward property now came with calloused hands and bowed heads, offering nails, planks, and apology like small currencies to stitch what greed had torn. Eli moved among the labor with a quiet that had weight, no show, no boast, only the steady metronome of a man who knows how to rebuild not for glory but to make a place honest again. He set posts with the patience of someone apprenticed to the land, his hands measuring grain and grit, voice reserved for the brief instructions that steady a crew. Clara worked beside him, sleeves rolled, hair braided back, laughter returning in surprised bursts when a calf found a new pen or a neighbor handed over a sack of seed, and the two of them became the slow center around which the valley reassembled itself. They plowed compacted soil until it remembered rain, turned the earth's face with pitchforks and sweat, re-nailed shutters and mended the blackened hearth until the house shone like a promise. Neighbors who had once sipped whiskey over ledgers now brought bread and coffee and honest labor, and their apologies were awkward and stiff at first, but each one laid another plank in the foundation of a new covenant. Children who had known Eli only by rumor came with wide-eyed curiosity, offered hay rides and simple chores, and in teaching them he taught the town how to plant, how to mend, how to name what had been taken so it might be returned. The kids called him Mr. Ward with the plain reverence reserved for men who do what they say. The preacher walked the fields with them and blessed the turned earth, his hands on posts and gates as if baptizing the land back into grace. May this ground remember mercy, he intoned, voice cracking like new wood, and those who had profited from silence now stood in the furrow and listened as if conscience had weight enough to steady a plow. Where fences were mended, neighbors mended speech too. Conversations that had been sharp and short grew longer, edged with the humility of people forced to face what they had done, and slowly the habit of honest work replaced the old habit of ledgered lies. The herd returned to pastures that once held Silas Ward's cattle, and their lowing knitted into a kind of prayer, a living chorus that stitched memory back into the valley's fabric. At dusk Eli stood on the porch of the repaired house, hat in hand, watching the light lay a slow coin across the fields. Clara came to him, palms stained with soil and a smile that carried the comfort of survival, and she whispered, "You've given this land back its soul, not as flattery but as the exact naming of what had been done. Truth set where silence had rested, and from that the earth had room to heal." The chapel bell rang not with triumph but benediction, and its sound rolled across the mesa while men paused mid-task and bowed their heads, a moment of shared contrition and hopeful labor. Eli remained a simple man in dress but not in spirit. The town's laughter had been burned away, replaced by a slow respect that comes from watching a man refuse to trade dignity for coin. Evenings filled with smaller stories now. Offenses fixed, favors returned. Neighbors lingered on porches to ask about seed and weather, and children chased one another near the troughs where water ran clean again. When the first calf of the season was born, a communal table was set and neighbors brought what they could: cornbread, coffee, cured ham, and the meal tasted of honest work and repaired faith. Eli lifted a glass with none of the old show, and said simply, "We do what's right," and the murmured assent around that rough table felt like a new covenant sealed in dust and sweat. Night came with stars that seemed to forgive, and Clara and Eli walked the fence line hand in hand, the land beneath them humming the quiet music of living things. In that steady, slow restoration the valley found not only mended fences but the moral architectural community needs: honesty, labor, and the small, stubborn love that keeps a place from being lost. Dawn came like a promise kept at last, the horizon melting from bruise to gold as Eli rode the ridge with the cool air sharpening his jaw and the weight of what had been settled sitting quiet in his saddlebag. Clara walked beside the gate for a moment, fingers trailing the top rail as if measuring the distance between what was lost and what was rebuilt. Then she kissed his weathered cheek like an affirmation and watched him go. the valley opening up before him like a page finally free to be read. They had been mocked once, laughed at, impudent at porches, called a union of pity, preacher's daughter and dust-booted man. The town had tallied worth in coin and brand, and their laughter had been easy because they could not see what Eli carried beneath his silence, a stubborn ledger of truth, names preserved like pearls, the patient hunger of a son who never forgot. But the ledger had been opened, the names read aloud beneath the church's rafters, and men had found their consciences lighter or heavier depending on what they were willing to carry. Some returned with planks and nails, others left with their heads bowed, and a few stayed so that the valley might learn the hard arithmetic of honesty. Now, as Eli rode, the land breathed around him, fences mended, fields furrowed neat, cattle dotting the green like promises kept, each turn of the road a testament to labor and the kind of forgiveness that is earned by work, not words. Clara stood at the farmhouse doorway until the dust line of his horse blurred into the distance. She kept his father's ledger, its such as worn in her hands, wrapped in a cloth on the mantle, not his treasure but his covenant. In the quiet that followed their storm, the community had rebuilt itself not on the quick silver of greed but on the slow gold of cooperation. Men who'd once signed away another's name now learned the measure of a man by how he returned what he'd taken. Mara Finch mended fences with a laugh that sounded like something healed. The preacher walked the fields with a hand on posts and a prayer that finally meant what it said. Children ran the lanes with the easy noisiness of those who feel safety in the bones of the valley again. Eli kept his silence as much as ever, but it had shifted, no longer a shield against scorn but a steady instrument of stewardship. He listened to the weather, to the cattle's lowing, to the land's small complaints, and he answered with deeds. The fortune they had found under the oak and in the barn was not bullion in velvet boxes. It was ink and names that called out the greedy and mapped the wrongs. Proof, Clara had said the first night they read the papers by lamplight. Proof is the sort of gold that forces men to remember. It had forced confessions, retractions, and, in time, restitution. Some men lost social standing and lived humbly thereafter. Some moved on, carrying shame like a hidden wound. Colt's shadow ended in a church aisle, the echo of his breath gone. And Eli found that inheritance had a strange appetite. It wanted repair more than riches. He had once measured his worth by dust and dignity. He now measured it by the lives he could set right. As he rode, the morning wind braided with the set of sage and new-turned earth, and he thought of Silas, a voice and lesson, and felt, for the first time since the night of the fire, a calm that was not hollow but earned. Clara did not chase him. She walked the fence line where neighbors paused and tipped their hats in a new way. Respect not born from fear but from watching a man choose truth over comfort. The narrator, if someone were listening to this valley's long story, would say, they laughed when she chose him, the man with dust for dreams. But love saw with gold could not. It kept the ledger when men would not, and it held a quiet courage that made the telling of truth less dangerous and more inevitable. In the end, fortune found them both, not in the glint of coins, but in the steadiness of redemption. Fences mended, names returned, graves named, children safe to run, a land that finally had its story told in honest ink and honest labor. The sun climbed, slow and generous, the grass bent with the wind and seemed to whisper thanks, and in the distance the chapel bell tolled, not for the dead alone, but for a community that had learned the cost of taking and the costly miracle of giving back. If this story stirred a memory or two, saddle up with us again. Hit subscribe and help keep these old frontier tales alive. Out here, every name, every trail, every sunset still matters. So till we meet again, friend, keep your half dip to the past and your heart pointed west.